Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of my Sons of Noah series. If you haven't watched my first video, I highly recommend it. You might be a little lost if you tried to start here. I have to address my views on certain verses and certain topics that were discussed on my TikTok, and I really want you guys to see my point of view, my beliefs, and why I believe them, and that I'm not just believing them because my brain is telling me that. I got asked this question quite a bit on my TikTok, so I want to address it. Why would God allow Nephilim DNA to come back onto the ark to then repopulate the earth if they were the reason for the flood in the first place? I need you guys to understand that the beginning of time, when Adam was still around and Noah had just been born, in that time frame, humanity was not just human. Humanity had very few humans and much more mixtures between angels and humans. We know for a fact, because our book of Genesis tells us that watchers mated with women, and we know that they had offspring because Genesis 6 tells us. Now, if you don't want to take extra biblical texts as actual word of God, then that's fine. But you cannot deny that God tells us that there were angel-human hybrids on the earth prior to the flood. He also says that all flesh is corrupt outside of Noah and his 3 sons. And the only way his 3 sons would be perfect in their genealogy would be that Noah and his wife had to both be perfect, leaving only the wives of Noah's sons to be the reason for Nephilim DNA to be back on the ark. Now, why would he do this? For a number of reasons. For pretty much the same reason he does everything. For our good. He works all things for our good. Not only does he redeem his people, the Israelites, the people who are loyal to him, by helping them to defeat every single giant that they encounter, but he himself is redeemed through his people, because the whole rest of the world knows what a mighty God he is, because he is able to defeat the giants. Because he's able to defeat these giants with the Israelites, the whole world reveres the God of the Israelites and reveres the Israelites themselves. Whether they worship Yahweh or not is irrelevant. They know who he is and they know his people, because he destroys the most powerful people on the earth, aka the giants, who were descendants of the men who were on the ark. Not only do you have stories like David and Goliath, but you have the story of the Philistines and the Anakim. And most importantly, you have the entire destruction, the desolation, the utter destruction of the Egyptians, who were worshippers of giants. All of their monolithic structures lead people to believe that they worshipped giant people. And I'll get into that in a moment, but that just proves to me that God had a real reason to keep this DNA around, because not only did he know that he could defeat and destroy all of this DNA later on, but he knew that it could be bred out very, very quickly. And again, I'm going to get to the genetics part in a minute. I hate to think that people don't trust that God does everything for our good, and they don't trust that God is bigger than everything, and he can destroy even the largest giants on the earth, even if he planned it. And nothing is too small for God, not even genetic information brought down through DNA. I mean, take a look at what's left of the giants today. Nothing. Hieroglyphs and some petrified bones. There's not much left of them today, and that's all because of God. Alright, so how does the DNA thing work? So let's talk about chromosomes for a second. Chromosomes are a thread-like structure found inside the nucleus of a cell, composed of DNA tightly coiled around proteins. Most scientists say that this has to be creator-driven, because nothing could have made something so perfect like DNA. So it's basically just a fancy way of saying that chromosomes are little data stores or information stores. They tell our DNA where to go, what to become, and what features to keep. Now, a man has both X and Y chromosomes, where a woman only has two X chromosomes, and this is very important. God makes Adam with X and Y chromosomes and then takes from Adam and makes Eve. He doesn't give Eve a Y chromosome, he doubles the X chromosome. This is why male offspring is more important than female offspring, and this is why the book of Genesis and every other genealogical reference in our Bible references only the men. It's because that Y chromosome is extremely important. The only two men that ever lived on the earth that got their Y chromosomes directly from God were Adam and Jesus. Think about how every single Y chromosome in the world has now had to come from Noah. And again, it is critical to note this because this is why Noah's sons were pure in their genes. It's absolutely 100% necessary for our story in the Bible, the story of our salvation, because through one man, sin came into the earth, and through one man, all humans are saved from sin. Now, the original Nephilim, the ones that came directly from male angels and female women, all got their Y chromosomes from angels. And again, like I said in my last video, God causes that very same generation, that very first generation that got their Y chromosomes from their fathers who were angels who are now bound in Tartarus, those angel-human hybrids were completely destroyed. All the rest of the angel-human hybrids on the earth either got their DNA from their fathers who had half human, half angel blood, or vice versa. Now, tainted genes from a woman are much easier to breed out, for lack of a better term. We know that giants can reproduce because in Numbers 13:33 it tells us that these men, these giants, were the sons of Anak, who was the direct descendant or son of Arba, who was a full-on giant. We also see in 2 Samuel where the giant with 6 fingers is the son of another giant. So if you remember in my last video, I talked about the generations of these angel-human hybrids. Unlike Rob Skiba's theory about him thinking that the mighty men of old might have been Eljo, I actually believe that they were a generation after Eljo. The first generation of angel-human hybrids were the Nephilim, then came the Nephilim, then came the Eljo, and the Eljo were giants, simply known as giants. I believe that Eliakim, the father of the 3 wives of the sons of Noah, whom God chose, might have mated with an Eljo woman. Can there be giant women? Yes, I believe so. Almost every pagan religion that talks about gods, demigods, and all those, they almost always have female gods. Goddesses like Isis, Diana, Ishtar, Ninsun, all the goddesses that I even mentioned are always depicted as giant. Hence why God would say to the Israelite people, kill the women, the children, and the animals. Before I get further into explaining the genetics, I want to show you guys images of elongated skulls. So a lot of archaeologists were finding these elongated skulls, and a lot of them were thought to have been artificially elongated. There were accounts of people who were binding their heads to then elongate them. However, a lot more skulls have been found that actually have their suture marks. Now, all that a suture mark is the 3 lines that are on a person's skull. And when someone manipulated the shape of their skull, their suture lines were different. However, these suture lines on this skull that Rob Skiba so wonderfully presented to us were naturally put there, meaning that this person or this woman's skull was naturally formed this way. Not different from Nefertiti and all of her depictions, and almost every Egyptian god has something going on with their head. they either have an animal head or they have elongated heads that need to be covered by hats. Not different from all of the Sumerian gods who do the same thing. They actually all wear conical hats. If you look at every single depiction of a Sumerian god or Canaanite god or Egyptian god, they're always wearing a headdress that covers the size of their head. These elongated skulls have been found in places all over the world. Places like Egypt, Peru, Malta, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Korea, Bolivia, Mexico, Siberia, Easter Island, China, and Old Sumeria, or rather all of Mesopotamia. Now let's go back to the Punnett square for a second, because I need to explain to you guys how this genetic deformity is a sign of Nephilim DNA. So imagine a Punnett square, and I've got it up here. You see that a Nephilim female would have one good X and one bad X, and then you have a human male would have all good X and Y chromosome. Let's put Ham and Neela on a Punnett square for a moment, just for argument's sake. Let's say we're trying to figure out what the possibilities were of their children coming out Nephilim or not. With a Punnett square, you're able to find out the possibilities of your offspring. You see that Neela would have one good X and one bad X, and you would see that Ham has both good X and Y chromosomes. Now you have 4 possibilities. It's a 50-50 chance that your children will have Nephilim DNA, because the DNA is coming from the mother. Because mothers only have X chromosomes, they cannot pass a Y chromosome. This would not be the case if it was a male fallen angel mating with a fully human woman. That chance of 50-50 shoots up to 1575. You have a 1 in 4 chance that your direct offspring will come out normal, and then you have a 1 in 4 chance that their children would come out normal. And again, this lowers your possibilities of ridding the human race of Nephilim DNA drastically. This is what I mean when I say genetics are a huge part of God's plan, and He had genetics in the mix from day one. He made man in His image, giving Adam his DNA directly, which is one of the main reasons the angels did not like the idea of humans being above them. It was because they were considered the sons of God, but not made in God's image. Right, so on my TikTok, I told you guys that every giant leads back to these 3 men who came off the ark. To give a few examples, you have Ham, who gives birth to Cush, who then gives birth to Nimrod, a very well-known giant. You also see Mizraim give birth to Casluhim, who gives birth to the Philistines, and then Caphtor, who is mentioned as being a giant. And all of Canaan's descendants, all of them, come out giant. You also have some from Shem's line. Shem gives birth to Asher, who become the Assyrians. He also gives birth to Esau, who then gives birth to the Edomites. Now, since we discussed the first generation of gods in the Sumerian pantheon, I want to go ahead and jump down to the second and third generations of the Sumerian pantheon. One of the main giants that we know of from our Bible is Nimrod. Nimrod, who created the Tower of Babel and who then caused the human race to be dispersed throughout the lands, and God confused their languages. So like I said in my last video, I do believe that Cush turns himself into Enki, one of the main gods in the Anunnaki. Enki, or Cush, was the founder of Sumeria. Marduk does not become the king of Sumeria, rather he becomes the king of his own kingdom, Babylon. Babylon derives from Sumeria, and the folklore states that Enki gave Marduk, passed the torch, if you will, to Marduk, and gave him authority over the people of that region. Yes, he renamed the kingdom to Babylon, and he became the new main deity of that time. It was almost like Cush knew that the only son that he had that was truly going to be able to continue this legacy of being gods was Marduk, or Nimrod. In their lore, it states how Marduk and Enki have a very close relationship, very much like a mentor and student, and Marduk learned all of his information, all of the knowledge of wisdom and creation from his father Enki. Nimrod lives 400 years, and he makes the Tower of Babel fairly early on in his life, only reigns for a certain amount of time after the Tower of Babel falls. And so the rest of the time, he is reigning over the Babylonian people, who now speak a different language from the rest of the scattered world. See, at that time, it seems like Marduk or Nimrod was one of the last giants to be around and to be that mighty. Even God says that he was mighty or giant in his sight. And it seems like Nimrod or Marduk was one of the last giants because he was one of the last true deities of Babylon or this Mesopotamian region. Marduk appoints a king to rule as kind of like a resident king. Now, Marduk continues to be the main deity of Babylon, but he passes his torch on to Hammurabi. And Hammurabi in the Semitic language is the kinsman healer. Now, to me, this is just speculation, but I believe that that indicates that Hammurabi was favorited by this very royal family because he was a healer of some sort, and so he was given the position of Ensi. Now, the Ensi didn't just become the resident king of these kingdoms, they also became the highest high priests of these gods. The Ensis were in charge of Babylonian trade, Babylonian religious rituals, Babylonian economy, and many, many more things. So naturally, they went from being the Ensi or the high priest to being the resident king, especially after Marduk or Nimrod dies. More information about Nimrod's death is found in the book of Jasher, and it gives us a really great story about how and why Nimrod dies. So Jasher tells us that Esau is about 15 years old when he kills Nimrod. Now, what's happening at that moment is that Esau has just found out that his younger brother, Jacob, has taken his birthright from him and tricked his father into giving him his blessing. Esau, rightfully being very upset, goes out into the wilderness and finds Marduk or Nimrod hunting. He sees him wearing the garments that would have also been passed down to him by his father Cush. Now, these garments were passed from Adam to Enoch and then to Methuselah, and Methuselah gives it to Noah. And then Ham steals it from Noah, then secretly giving it to Cush. These garments are said to be the garments that Adam was given after he was exiled from the Garden of Eden, and God had an animal to take its fleece and give it to Adam. This is the same golden fleece talked about in the Greek mythology. Being now doubly upset, one because his inheritance was taken by his brother and another piece of his inheritance taken by his cousin, he, in a fit of rage, kills Nimrod and beheads him. Shortly after Nimrod's death, we see Hammurabi come up in his kingdom. He goes from being a high priest to being a king, and he's even commissioned by Enki and another goddess, Baal, to write the Code of Hammurabi. Remember that Cush's very favorite son was Nimrod. He was the only one that was mighty in God's eyes. And so he believed that Nimrod would be able to take over the kingdom for him and continue this line. He showed him how to rebel against God, how to continue being a god in the eyes of men. He taught his son the secret language of the angels. He taught his son everything that he knew, from magic, creation, wisdom. All of that was passed down to Marduk, and when Marduk dies, he is devastated, and so he commissions Hammurabi to write the Code of Hammurabi. Even Josephus, the famous Hebrew or Israelite scholar from the 1st century, agrees that Cush and Nimrod had a great relationship, and that it seems from the book of Jasher that Cush really did teach Nimrod how to rebel against God and taught Nimrod idolatry. And so it matches up perfectly with the Sumerian lore of these two men. You can find all this information in the Enuma Elish, which is the Epic of Marduk. Now, I also want you to take into consideration what the name Anunnaki means. When you put the name together in the way that the Sumerians have spelled it, in the Sumerian language, it literally means princess of royal seed, which again goes back to this genetics argument. Women of this bloodline were worshipped because the women in this bloodline were the ones carrying the Nephilim DNA. Nila Tamaug would have, of course, made herself a goddess, but she would have been the main goddess because her DNA of Nephilim would have been the absolute strongest, which is why she herself mates with her sons multiple times and makes more giants, albeit smaller giants, but giants nonetheless. That's another reason why you see Inanna and Ninsun also giving birth to great men of renown. We know that this is the very first religion in recorded history, and this religion deifies women. Not only does it deify them, but it puts the women, the female goddesses, above the male gods. It's even said in the Sumerian lore that Enki himself wanted to rebel against the female gods, Ki, Inanna, and Ninsun, because he wanted to help the people of the world. He wanted to show the people the secret language of the gods. Now, this secret language to me seems like the same language that the angels taught the humans. This secret language that the Sumerians claim that could alter reality, that could cause magical things to happen. I believe all of this is because Ham and Nila are teaching their children what Nila already knew prior to the flood. She would have lived at least 100 years before the flood actually happens, giving her plenty of time to learn the ways of her, what I believe to be, Eljo mother. And her Eljo mother most likely taught her and her two sisters how to do magic and how to manipulate reality using this magic or this secret language. And again, during this time, this is when writing is invented. Writing was not really a common thing before the Sumerian civilization. Everything was word of mouth, which is another reason why we know that Enoch preached God's word and Noah preached God's word. Also, Abraham preached God's word without needing a canonical Bible. They spoke directly to God, and so they didn't need to write things down in order to portray what needed to be said. Now, writing is supposedly invented in the year 3200 BC, and this writing is called cuneiform. And this is, again, around the same time when Ham and Nila would have separated from Noah and begun their own kingdom. So something interesting about the Sumerian culture is that they started as Sumeria as a civilization, but prior to Sumeria, there is this time period called the Ubaid period. Many archaeologists and scholars have found that this Ubaid period was the beginnings of the large Sumerian/Mesopotamian civilization. They lived extremely basic lives. They farmed, they grew agriculture, and they traded with other places. Something very, very interesting is that they did a lot of pottery, and they used what was in the ground. The ground was clay rich in this area, and so their pottery was mainly made of brick. Their homes were mud brick homes. In Genesis 11:3, we see that God tells us that the first people on the earth used mud brick to make their homes. This area, even with its small civilization, not even truly becoming a full kingdom yet, already had temples where people worshipped. So from the very beginning, you had Ham and Nila, Cush, Put, Mizraim, and Canaan seen as higher class than those around them. There are many of these temple sites where the Ubaid people would have lived. There's some in Iran, some in Iraq. Most of northern Mesopotamia has proof of these deity altars or temples. So under Cush, this land becomes known as Uruk. Ur and Uruk end up becoming Sumeria, and Sumeria then breaks off into smaller sections like Acadia and Babylon. Also in this Ubaid period, I forgot to mention, it was proven that they spoke a Semitic language, a derivative of Aramaic or Hebrew. This is another indication to me that they are directly linked to Noah, because Noah would be the one who would know the Semitic language. After Babylon is no longer considered Babylon, but then becomes Ur of the Chaldeans, that's when Abraham is born. During that time of the Chaldeans is when we see King Nebuchadnezzar II. We see him in multiple books in our Bible. Now I want to point out who the Chaldeans were. The Chaldeans were a Semitic language speaking set of people who integrated into Babylon. Archaeologists have found that these people considered themselves part of the line of Shem. Most theologians and scholars don't want to believe that the line of Shem had anything to do with the Chaldeans, because the Chaldeans brought the studies of stars and astrology to the world. But I want to mention something very, very specific. In the book of Jubilees and the book of Jasher, it describes how the son of Shem, Sereg, finds a stone with angelic information on it. He writes down the information that's on this stone and doesn't tell Noah about it for fear of Noah's anger. I believe that the sons of Sereg end up becoming the Chaldeans and join the Babylonians later on, forsaking the one true God, Yahweh, and cleaving to the angelic magic that their father Sereg found. Through the Chaldeans, the Babylonians move away from deity worship and more into star worship, and they become more of magicians. Specifically, Nebuchadnezzar's father is the one who integrates the Chaldeans as the main priesthood in New Babylon. It is still called Babylon, but the Chaldeans, the group of people known as Chaldeans, were the people who were in charge of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar was their king. Going back to Abraham having known these Chaldeans, Genesis 12:1, God commands Abraham to leave his father. Why would he do that? Why would he cause him to leave his father when you're supposed to stay with your father and your father's house? Well, the book of Jasher elaborates on that as well. It tells us how Abraham had a huge argument with his father about his idol worship. Even after this interaction, Terah refuses to follow Yahweh because he feels that he will be exiled and excommunicated from his kingdom, which is Ur of the Chaldees. And there, yes, they may not have fully continued to worship deities like Marduk, but they still respected their deities and had many temples. And so people in Ur still believed in the gods. Abraham is then told by God to leave his father and his homeland. This further proves to me that Abraham was extremely dedicated to Yahweh. He was probably one of the only people left on the earth who really did cleave to Yahweh. And it's a very interesting story of how he connects with Yahweh, because again, he was born into a world where they fully worshipped idols. And so he goes outside one night and he's looking up at the stars and the moon, and he says, why would I worship those things? Why wouldn't I worship what made those things? And God immediately begins to talk to him. And so Yahweh and Abraham form a connection, a relationship, and Abraham chooses to be loyal to God for all the rest of his days. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. Stick around for part 3. I have a lot more to go over, but I don't want to overwhelm you guys with information on each video. I also don't want to make it too long because it's a lot. So I hope you guys will join me on the next one, and have a blessed rest of your week.